Welcome to From the Think Space from EduPulse. In this new series, we meet the inspiring people driving change in education, shaping ideas, sparking debate, and reimagining what's possible.
Hello and welcome, listeners, back to another episode of the EduPulse podcast. And we are back into From the Thought Space section of our podcast this week. Although our guest this week does actually span both chalk face and thought space, because not only is he a fantastic author, speaker and thinker, but he's also back on the chalk face 3 days a week as a teacher as well. So I'm delighted to introduce to our guest this evening, Mr. Richard Wheadon. How are you, Richard?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Cheers.
And that is quite the unique sort of circumstance that you've got. I think that you do an awful lot of speaking. You've got 2 books, both of which we're going to talk about that are coming out soon. We're going to talk about both of them tonight. But then you also are class teaching 3 days a week as well, having previously led schools and stepped away from that to get back in that chalk face teaching 3 days a week, right?
Yeah. You know what? I've really enjoyed it. Like, it was quite scary leaving, a leadership position that I was really comfortable in and we're doing really well.
Yeah.
But actually being in a classroom all day and your only priority in a school is the kids in front of you, like, it's brilliant. Like, all the stuff I've learned as a leader, I'm so much better teacher than I was when I left the full-time classroom like 10 years ago. But I don't have the headspace to focus. I didn't as a leader to completely focus on the classroom. And now for those 3 days, that's it. They're my priority. And I'm really just enjoying it. It's great to be in a classroom all day. And the days go fast when you're teaching 5 periods. It's great fun. It's an interesting. Yeah, you said it's probably quite unique. I don't know how many people out there are trying to do the both. A bit of working with other schools, consultancy, and doing stuff with the books, but being in a classroom. But yeah, I found the balance really enjoyable at the moment.
I bet. And has it been quite liberating getting back into the classroom and teaching kids?
Yeah. So I wrote a blog on it a couple of months ago about the fact that, like, I've definitely improved my practice. Because one of the problems, and all the stuff that you talk about in terms of coaching, and like, it's really hard to develop routines when you're teaching an hour a day.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time I'm kind of every year I'm kind of thrown into a year 11 class at the last minute, and I've got like 5 months to get them their GCSEs. So and so I'm trying to fill all those gaps. I'm not necessarily developing new routines. I'm just kind of firefighting with year 11s, and then obviously I've got a lot of sixth form normally, because you can leave the room when there's safeguarding things and things like that. So key stage 3 I hadn't taught for years. And now that's all that I teach, because I'm part-time. We made the decision that they didn't want me to have exam classes because of commitments to other things. So I just go in, I teach kind of 11 to 14-year-olds 5 hours a day, and I'm developing my practice because there's things that I've wanted to do that I didn't, because I just didn't have that consistency. And now I am, and I know I'm really enjoying it.
I think there's a lot to be said as well for the relationships. And I think that's something you definitely miss as a leader who dips into classroom teaching. So I teach at the moment kind of 2 days a week, but sort of spread over the week. And like probably a day of that is like set, and then the other day is like, I'll dive in here and I'll jump in there and I'll do a little bit there. And you do find that you end up teaching classes where you don't have the relationship that the class teacher has, and you don't have the routines, and you don't have the background of what they've studied previously and what they're going on to next. And you do feel a little bit isolated and quite vulnerable going into that. So,
and one of the things I realized, well, I did know this, but it really made it really clear, is that, like, kids in my school, I'd been there for years and done well, and kids in my school knew that they do. What's that noise? Is that my computer making that noise?
No.
Oh,
That's my phone buzzing away.
Oh, that's fine. I wasn't sure if something was turning off. So you realize in a school that you build a reputation, right? So when kids would walk into my class in year 11, they're walking in going, he's a good teacher. They know that their brothers and their siblings were taught. So they walk in feeling like they're going to be successful, right? Because I've got this, I'm a senior leader in a school. They know I'm a good teacher, whatever. But when you walk into a brand new school, especially when you're taking over a maternity cover, those kids don't know that you're good. Those kids don't know that you're going to go in and help them improve. So they walk in almost like watching waiting for it. So you've got to build that reputation back. And I'd lost that realization that when you walk into school, to motivate kids from scratch is really hard. And I'd rested on my kind of gravitas in the school to do that first bit for me.
Yeah,
Kids would walk in going, I'm going to be successful because I've got Mr. Wheadon.
yeah,
Whereas walking in fresh on a maternity cover, that just wasn't the case. And kids would walk in almost like, who's this guy? He's gone in 6 months. How is he going
mm,
to help me? I know in some cases, especially with some of the kids, with some of our SEND kids, like they were really nervous about having a new teacher. The teacher had to like give them weeks and weeks notice to say, I'm going off on maternity leave. You've got someone new coming in. Some of these kids' anxiety was really high. So not only have you got someone new coming in, they're really nervous about this person and the change of routines that they had put in place. We were really lucky with the maternity leave that I got to watch the teacher for 3 weeks, which isn't very common because
mm.
of financial reasons, but I got to look at her routines to try and make the transition as smooth as possible going in for some of the kids that really, struggled. But yeah, walking in and kids not knowing who I am, my reputation, meant that I couldn't rely on some of the things that maybe got me through some of the tougher spots in my last school. So, but yeah, it's been really interesting on the outside to look at it as well, and yeah, enjoyable. And as I said, taught a full day today. I really enjoyed it, and I've got enough time to sit here with you and talk about 2 books and part-time teaching.
Yeah, and that leads us really nicely on to the idea of learning habits, right? Which is the title of the first book.
Yeah,
And it sounds like from what you're saying there that this idea of habit is something that you've become acutely aware of the importance of since you've gone back into the classroom. If we weren't already aware of it as well, it links really nicely to probably one of my all-time favorite research papers, which is David Berlin back in 1988, and he did this experiment with some novice teachers and expert teachers. I talk about it a lot on this podcast, and where the expert teachers were put into the situation of having to teach a group of 15 students who they'd never met before, and they, long and short of it is, a lot of them kind of went to pieces with this task because they weren't able to realize the benefits of their really well defined and well established routines in their own teaching because they'd never met these students before. So habits are important, routines are important. That brings us nicely onto learning habits, the first book. What sparked that off?
yeah. So what it was, our school, the school I was in, was really successful. Uh, we were doing well, within the city of Liverpool. It had a good reputation. Um, Ofsted had come in a couple of times and were really happy with the teaching, and so kind of everything was kind of going well. Now, but the problem was when we got our GCSE results, when we looked through the list, we were looking at our predictions for some of our kids, and they weren't matching up to what we thought they would be. They did well, but not the high kind of lofty expectations we'd set ourselves and we'd set for them. Um, and so when I started interviewing the kids when they joined the sixth form, I went through child after child after child, trying to unpick kind of, what went wrong. Why didn't you get what we kind of expected? Um, and the bottom line is that the kids made really poor decisions, both
Mhm.
outside the classroom when they left our classrooms, but also in our classrooms as well. Kids were saying to me, there were times when they were copying from the person next to them. These were year 11 students who, when schools use different versions of them, but attitude to learning, whatever you might call it, teachers would say, these are good kids.
Mm.
These are kids that work hard. They do lots of stuff. They're not necessarily catching out on assessment for learning, that they're getting stuff wrong, things like that. But they would do it, little poor things, copying from the person next to them, on their homework, using ChatGPT, being quite honest about it. They've now got their GCSEs out of the way. They're being honest now and saying, well, I didn't fully engage with what I wanted to do. Things like that. And then when it got to outside of school, it just went worse. Like, despite the fact that we were doing assemblies on retrieval and what it should look like, go and use flashcards, we modeled it, we thought we'd modeled it, but at the bottom line, kids went home when they got to their comfort and they chose strategies that were not what we wanted them to do. And it became really clear that these kids were poor learners. And for first, I didn't have an answer to that. So that was when my starting point. My starting point was: is the kids in our school that, despite us telling them what to do, they weren't doing it. And so, like anyone does at that point, I'm lost. So I go out to look at some books, and to come down to some research eds. And I read lots of books about revision. There's a really good one, Revision Revolution, that I read, and I thought, actually, we're doing some of these things, we could do some more, but they didn't get to the bottom of my problem. And what was really interesting is that, we were in the same room actually. It was Sarah's talk down in
Mm.
London, And it triggered something
with
for
Neil
me that was,
Gilbride.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what was interesting is that I was there. We were there talking about adaptive expertise in teaching, right? The session was about mental models and about teachers making good decisions in the moment. And as I sat there, like I had my half hat on about instructional coaching because I was still a senior leader focused on that. But I had half a listening, thinking, how can I take what I'm learning today to do with kids' decision making, not necessarily teachers? And if you remember back to the session, Sarah had an example where a kid put their head on the desk and was asking the question, like, what would you do in that scenario? And we were all like answering questions. And basically the point is that there was not one right answer. There was your decision changed based on what the moment, the day, who the kid was, what period it was, the rest of the class. And we almost make the decision as experts ourselves, in inverted commas, based on all of our understanding of everything that happened before, right? So I'm sitting there thinking, in order to make a good decision, me as a teacher, I had to know so much about teaching and about students and about all these different things I had to understand. And even then, I don't always make the best decision. I sometimes get it wrong. So the more I thought about what she was applying to teachers, the more I thought, like, this same idea has to be applied to kids. Because in order for teachers to make good decisions, they need to have a better knowledge of what teaching and learning is, right?
Hmm.
So by the same principle, and it became really obvious when it dawned on me, it became really obvious. And in order for kids to make good decisions about learning, they have to fundamentally understand what learning is. And some of the work that you guys set me off on, we're looking at like Klein and things like that. Like, it became really clear that experts in their field, to become an expert, had obviously years of experience, but that came with a deep knowledge of the thing that they were an expert of. And so the bottom line was, for me, if kids are going to make better decisions around learning, we can't expect it just to happen. They have to become experts at learning. So that was my premise. That's what it started off as. How do we develop these kids to become expert learners? And then linked to that, the second half of the book, the second word, habits, didn't really arise till later, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more afterwards. But like, what I became really aware of as the more research I did it's really hard for kids to make good decisions. There are so many barriers to them making the right decision when it comes to learning, that in order to make them actually change a habit of a lifetime, they have to actually go about changing it. And changing habits is really, really hard. And so even when a kid has a better understanding of what they need to do, doesn't mean they're going to do it if they've been doing the wrong thing for a long, long time. So they have to become expert learners, but they also have to form these habits to change their kind of decisions over time. Because just by knowing what you should do doesn't mean you're going to do it. And you do the same in instructional coaching, right? The reason rehearsal happens is because when a teacher's agreed, yes, this is the better option to do in my classroom, doesn't mean the next day they're going to go and do it. They have to rehearse. They have to practice it over and over again until it becomes a habit. And so the same principle. So what's really interesting is a lot of the work that you were doing, I saw Step Lab do, I read Josh's book, and Sarah, like, you applying all of this stuff to making teachers adaptive expertise. And I was taking everything that you were offering and applying the same principles to kids. And kind of that's where it was born out of. So it was, it's really interesting for me that I was learning from you all, but for a completely different reason. But
Yeah, yeah.
the principles are the same.
And that's the way it should be as well. And then now we get to learn from you when we read the book and when we
Yeah,
get to
yeah,
talk
yeah.
about these kinds of things as well. It's the way that the kind of ecosystem of the education sector should work, I think. So
Yeah.
there was one thing you said in there. You said, "Oh, we were already doing assemblies and things on retrieval practice. So what did you do differently then with this? Because if we're saying kids need to know about how learning happens in order to make better decisions about learning, about how they learn, what was
Yeah.
different about what you then went on to do rather than what you were doing in the first place, which was, as you said, like assemblies on retrieval practice? You're already covering this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the key to the difference is, well, but before I go there, so the main thing is to appreciate that the kids, like, when we talk, I won't go into detail on it, but schemas and mental models. I know lots of people talk about those two words and interchangeable or whatever. Well, they are or they're not. But one of the issues, like, I kind of unpicked, is that the schema aspect, kids had these arbitrary kind of facts, right? So kids knew stuff about revision. Kids knew that retrieval was a thing. Kids knew that interleaving was a thing. So so that's what the assemblies kind of did. Provide them with this knowledge. And so if you say to a kid, what is retrieval practice, they could tell you. right?
Right.
Right. So they had these facts in their head. What they didn't have is the kind of the interlinking between how these things actually work in practice, what they look like, and how they kind of interchange. And so one of the things I suggest in the book is the same way that we do with adults. It's about coaching, actually coaching individual kids, and kind of scenario based stuff where you're actually unpicking their decision making, where kids made the decision, in the same way you would with a coach with a lesson. You
Yeah.
would say, right, okay, you went and did this. Tell me kind of why you would do it. So it's actually having that conversation. But way before we get there, because that's kind of like a later stage when you've got kind of some of your most challenging kids that aren't changing. The first thing is to go into a much more detailed thing than go kind of beyond the one-off assemblies. And so what that required me to look at was, right, let's break down, which is kind of the first kind of chapter of the book. Let's break down the last kind of 100 years of cognitive science and break it down into chunks that actually make sense to students. So rather than standing up and saying this is retrieval practice, go and do it,
Yeah.
our goal was to teach kids fundamentally how does the brain work. Like, why do we actually need retrieval practice? Why is that going to be better than something else? And so what I've tried to do in the book is take the principles that we're aware of as educators and actually teach them to kids in a way that kind of makes sense. So one of the ones, it's a really, it's in Daniel Williams' book, but also I've seen Daisy do it at a conference, is when you take the George Miller's experiment with the 15 letters, and you ask someone to memorize 15 letters,
Yeah.
and kids get about 7 of them, and then you put them in chunks, like cat, dog, and then kids can remember all of them. So it's like that, but a slight spin I take on that in the book is that once you've done the kind of cat, dog, hat, those words, and kids realize they've got now 5 chunks rather than 15 random letters, you then add an extra layer to that, which is you take those words and you make them kind of social media acronyms. So you take like LOL, FYI, BRB, and things that kids would be familiar with, but not the same as, cat and dog. And so the point of that is when kids do that exercise and they get, 15 letters right, is to ask them a question like, how would your grandparents do at this test? If you gave your grandparents the letters BRB, LOL, FYI, would they see them as 5 words or would they see them as 15 letters? And so having that conversation and kids going, well, they would only get 7 letters right because they wouldn't
Mm.
see this the same way we would. And what that does is lead to a conversation about kind of chunking, about working memory, about pre-existing knowledge. And it opens a whole can of worms for the kids of going, hang on a minute, like, there's that eureka moment, and realizing, how am I suddenly brighter than my grandparents? I'm not. This prior knowledge is really, really important. And so what we tried to do was give them kind of the eureka moments, because a lot of good learning habits are kind of counterintuitive to what kids think. We almost have to give them the shock value, that realizing that it's not what they thought. And actually, this concept of working memory is actually important. Me understanding that my working memory is based on my prior knowledge is going to be really important for me to make better decisions in the future. But whereas we have maybe in the past just said to kids, right, by the way, retrieval works because we move it from here to here and it gets in your long-term memory, actually making them appreciate how their working memory works for them and why it is limited and how they can overcome that in a way that makes sense to a 12 or 13-year-old, is the door opening them to them questioning their kind of decision making. So the starting point really is to actually teach the same way we did. We didn't get that at university, but ACTs are now getting taught cognitive science at university. We've
Mm.
had to
Yeah.
learn kind of afterwards, but letting them learn in a way that makes sense for them. So the first thing is to give them the knowledge of how their brain works. And so they can start off with the knowledge. And so we're not having to close the knowing doing gap like the same way we do in teaching. The kids have the knowledge. And the next step is to go, right, now you have all of this knowledge. Let's unpick why you sometimes make poor decisions, and why not. So that's the opening. So in the book, there are 3 themes: learning, thinking, and habit formation. And the first part really is to get kids to understand how learning happens. And then secondly, the significant link between that and the idea that thinking deeply is obviously really important. And that was a big one for me, because one thing that we can't control in a classroom, and we can try to, and there are lots of things that we do to increase it, but to actually control the thought process in a child's head when you are speaking is not possible. Like, we can direct it, we can get whiteboards, we can do call response, we can do things to try and direct a kid to what we want, but ultimately what's going on in their head in that moment is theirs. So if I'm, lots of teachers tell stories of when they do Now, my worst ever lesson was when we made ice cream in the classroom, and I was supposed to be teaching solids, liquids, and gases. And the kids all remembered that I made ice cream, and no one remembered solids, liquids, and gases, right? But on the same note, if I'm in a classroom and I'm teaching something, like, and I've suddenly, I told a story the other week about scurvy on a ship from Africa, so on and so on. And some kid might turn around in that lesson and suddenly go, "Oh, I went on a boat once." They could be
Yeah.
thinking about a boat that they went on to Greece, right? There's a random connection they can make in the lesson that has nothing to do with what I'm teaching, and then they don't remember anything that I taught. They just remember their trip to Greece. And so actually we can try and control kids' thinking, by certain strategies. But ultimately there's a level of independence there. The kids make choices about what they're thinking about in the lesson, blindly not realizing that if they think about a story going on holiday to Greece for 3 minutes in the middle of my lesson, they're probably going to remember in 2 weeks about Greece and not about scurvy on slave trade ships.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of idea that if we want kids to be responsible for their learning, they have to fundamentally understand just how easy it is for them to go off task and how that can really affect what they will kind of remember afterwards.
I think there's an awful lot to unpack there, and
Mm.
that's such a great answer. But I think like a couple of things that really stand out. So this idea of almost like generating these moments of insight for
Yeah.
students, where you allow them to feel and to experience the difference in, as you said there, with the letters and the letter
Mm.
strings, and giving them that experience of how much easier it is when you are able to chunk letters up into words or into acronyms. So you're generating those moments of insight, which again then generates this a much deeper level of belief and buy-in into what you're expecting them and asking them to do. So that's a layer further than just standing at the front of the room and telling them
Exactly.
retrieval
Yeah, yeah.
practice is good, right? That you're allowing them to feel and to experience the effects of in this case chunking, that then produces that deeper level of belief and buy-in. And linked to that, we have in our book, I've written with Sarah and Hailey, we talk about the adaptive expertise framework and how we go from
Mm.
understand to do to decide to improve, and
Yeah.
improving sort of underpinning all of it. So it sounds like similar to what you've done there, really. So it's you've moved from, okay, they understand that retrieval practice is a good thing, to actually they know how to do retrieval practice, but they're only going to decide to do it if they get to experience the difference that it makes to the success that they have, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because and into like the more research I did, and that's kind of like my starting point. But the more research I did, the more I realized just how hard it is for kids to make good decisions. So especially when it comes to thinking. So learning, I was really confident. Before I started the whole research in the book, learning, I was like, I understand what learning is, right? Nothing in the book that I've written was something that I didn't already know. I was just putting it in a way that made sense to students. When I
Mhm.
got to thinking, um, and why thinking so important, and I use, Danny Williams' phrase, memory is the residue of thought. I think I've quoted about 9 times in the book. Like, when if all kids, by the way, knew that memory is a residue of thought and they appreciated that, and then we've solved a lot of kind of problems. But when we get to thinking, a lot of my kind of research led me to Daniel Kahneman's work about fast thinking and slow thinking,
Mhm.
and kind of mainly the cognitive biases that exist when we fast think. And so
Yeah.
there's two in particular that kind of there's lots of them, but there are two that I really underpinned just how hard it is for kids to make good decision making. And one of them, which I think was the biggest one, was the sunk cost fallacy.
Mhm.
And so once once you've taught kids how learning happens and they have an understanding of that, the next thing is to appreciate, even though you understand that, you still make poor decisions because your thinking is biased. And unless an example of that is sunk cost fallacy. And so the example that I give in the book that you can share with students, and it was based on a real study, but I've obviously again tweaked it. And it's interesting. I've done workshops up and down the country and abroad where I've asked kids this exact question, and the answers are pretty similar to kind of the real one. And so what you ask them is a basic question where you say, you want to go to a £20 concert, and you try to buy a ticket, but it's sold out, so you can't go. And then you realize there's another concert that night, but it's £100. So you decide to buy that ticket because you want to go out that evening, and you buy £100 ticket, right? And so a week later, your friend has a spare ticket to the £20 concert, and they offer it to you, and they're on the same night. Well, you don't. So you buy the £20 ticket, but then you've got to make a decision which concert you go to: the £20 one that you originally wanted to go to,
Yeah.
or the £100 concert. When Kahneman did this original study, 47% of people still picked the £100 concert, despite the fact that they would have preferred and always wanted to go to the £20 concert. I've done this up and down the country, and it's pretty 50-50. It's still, it's pretty split everywhere I've done with different age groups. And this idea of sunk cost fallacy, mainly in the financial world, is about why businesses fail, right? People spend time and effort and money into running a business. And then when it gets to the point where they should close the business and stop because they've invested so heavily in it, they almost trick themselves into thinking that they can't possibly give up on something because they've spent so long. And so the cost that they've sunk is overvalued when it comes to future decision making. And so if we think about kids like this, kids go through years of school of making potentially poor decisions. They might be making revision posters with pretty words on them, which a lot of our year 11s have been doing for several years. They get to year 11 and we say, hey, everyone go and use retrieval practice now. This is how you should do it. But they've sunk 5 years into ineffective strategies
Mm.
that they've invested in heavily for 5 years, right? So you suddenly tell a year 11 kid, everything you've been doing for 5 years, stop it. But businesses fail over the same rationale, poor decision making. And yet we expect a 16-year-old to give up on the commitment that they've been using for years just because the teacher said so.
I think
You
it's
know?
even harder for students as well, because
Yeah.
what you're getting at there with those, if you take those 16-year-olds, like, yeah, they've got a lot of sunk cost into these ineffective strategies,
Mm.
but they're still probably succeeding to a large extent.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the other thing that's really key because I think I talk about my own daughter a lot in the book. And she she's a successful student.
Mm.
She did a year six SATs last year in year six, and she's gone into year seven now. Um, and there are strategies that she was doing that she wasn't even aware if they were good or not. No, she was, so for example, like TT Rockstars, she used it every single day, right? Every
Mhm.
single day she was using it. Her multi times tables were really, really good, right? So when she does a year six SATs, without even realizing it, she can do fractions because she's not getting cognitively overloaded because
Yeah.
she has a kind of automaticity when it comes to the times tables, right? She's in year seven now. Her times tables are worse today than they were 12 months ago,
Yeah.
because she was doing them every single day. So I'm sitting with her now doing her homework last week and she's doing fractions and she can't do stuff she could do in year six. Because when
Yeah.
I ask her to do the fraction, she go, well, what's that multiplication again? So she's having to, her working memory is being used to do stuff that it wasn't being used for 12 months ago.
Mm.
And yet she's not aware. She's just sitting in year seven getting frustrated, going, well, why can I not do this stuff? I could do it a year ago, you
Yeah.
know? And although, I'm trying to teach her habits from the book, like, kind of, she's unaware of what it took to pass those SATs. Like, what was it that made her a successful mathematician a year ago? The automaticity of the multiplications. No teacher sat her down. She never had that eureka moment. She made it real. Like, if I do these times tables, then I'm going to be so much easier doing everything else. That conversation,
Yeah.
which I'm suggesting the book can provide, it didn't happen, and it isn't necessarily happening in schools. And so, although teachers might say go and do times tables, like, we owe it to kids to give them the backstory as to why that is so important. Because if she knows why she's making those decisions, then she's maybe more likely to stick with similar decisions kind of later on. And instead, what happens when you get to year seven, you get demotivated, and you instead find more comforting strategies like the copying notes or whatever it might be, things that make you feel good in the moment. They give you instant grab. I've seen her. She did her homework with what was it, Seneca, who's geography, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna make some notes," and no one ever, I've never done notes with her, but for whatever
Mm.
reason, she's like, actually copying this stuff from one place to another, but it makes you feel good. You leave feeling like you're successful, you've done something, right? So she was doing good things in year six. She's now got to year seven. She hates maths in year seven, which is a real shame, but she does because she never wanted to really commit to it, but she did because she wanted to do well in the SATs.
Mm.
And now she's like, stop doing times tables every night. It's because she's got 10 subjects to do rather than two.
Yeah.
She
Yeah.
hasn't got the
Yeah.
time to commit to maths. And so suddenly she is a worse mathematician today on paper. If she sat a SATs exam today, 6 months after the last one, I'm confident she'd get less than the score she got before.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right. And so it's that idea that, even when kids are good kids, good in inverted commas, and they're working hard, she has no idea of the back step that she's had and why she's had it. And when that does, it leads to frustration. And we know that success leads to motivation and not the other way around. And
Mm.
so when she stops being successful at maths, she gets demotivated. And then it's this spiral, isn't it? And so that's where I'm coming from. You know, a lot of schools want me to work with year 11s, and I always say no. The sunk cost fallacy. All these decisions have been made by
Yeah.
then. Kids have lost their interest in maths 5 years earlier. We need to help these kids make better decisions in year 4 or 5. You know,
And
so they understand what they're doing.
that's where you're getting at the one thing that's coming through really, really keenly is this independence thing. So it's about
Yeah,
not just, and I think that that's something we can be guilty of, is like giving kids the strategies, but also just but giving them to them without telling them what we're doing, right? So
mm,
primary school is a great example. Do 15 minutes a day of times table rock stars. So she's doing that routine. She's engaging in that routine because she's been told to do it, and because it's kind of
yeah,
gamified as well, and she wants to get the
yeah,
top
yeah,
score in the class and all that kind of thing, without understanding like cognitively what the effect of that is and why that is so successful and why that works. And I think what you're saying is we owe it to them to explain to them and let them feel why that's so effective, in the hope that they will then make the decision to continue to do that kind of thing for themselves in the future. So they're able to become way more independent in terms of the habits that they form. They're not reliant on teachers to form those habits for them and to kind of control those habits in the homework that they give and in the classwork that they give, but they
yeah,
can actually go and do it for themselves.
yeah. It's interesting because one of the things Carl Hendrick talks about a lot in terms of like explicit instruction, you know, one of my favorite things he says is like, you would never let kids just drive a car, you
Mm,
know, which is why you don't let them just teach themselves, right? You would always explicitly teach a kid how to drive a car, right? And so I say the same thing when it comes to, you know, independence. Like, you can't just
yeah,
let a
yeah.
kid guess independence. Like
Mhm.
you know, that's what we do. And a lot of the time they get to sixth form and we suddenly say, oh, now everyone go and make Cornell notes. Go, you know, maybe they'll have a 20-minute session on it.
Mm,
Go and make these notes this way, and just expect kids to make better decisions. You know, and they don't. And what's really interesting is when I looked at the research, like, we're behind when it comes to like sectors outside of education. So you look at medicine, the medical field. There's a professor of emergency medicine in America called Kloskuri, who I've quoted a lot in the book. Like, they teach doctors about cognitive biases. Like,
mm,
you
mm.
get taught explicitly, you make bad decisions as a doctor, they're going to happen. These are the decisions you're going to make that are poor. They have scenario-based practice. They sit with scenarios and they unpick why doctors make bad decisions. And what we know from the research is teaching cognitive biases to doctors, just knowing that they exist, makes them make better decisions. We know that from the research shows doctors do it all the time. So if doctors are doing it and they recognize how important it is for doctors to be aware of their biased decision making, then why are we not bringing that down to younger kids? I think we owe it to kids to go, by the way, you're likely to go home and make pretty notes because of
Mhm.
X, Y, and Z. Like, you know, otherwise we're not giving them the tools to make the right decisions, and then they're getting frustrated, and then they're failing and underachieving, and then
Mm.
they quit. In the worst case scenario, then they're quitting. You know, and
Yeah.
they're saying, "Oh, I'm not a successful student anymore." You know, and that's my worry. When I start the book, and I think this is, you know, my lofty goal. The very first paragraph says, "Imagine a student sitting in a lecture at university." And they're sitting there and they're listening to the lecturer, and the child sits in the lecture and they recognize, hang on a minute, I'm lost. You know, there's too much going on in this lecture. I've got cognitive overload. Like, there's too much, the gap between what I already know and what's being taught is too great. So in that moment, the student stops doing what they're doing. They stop trying to write down everything in Cornell notes fashion, what they've been taught in high school. They then suddenly realize, I'm just going to write down every tier 3 word that comes out of my lecturer's mouth, because that's all that I've got brain capacity to do right now. I can't follow anything else. It's pointless. I'm just going to write down all the tier 3 words, because when I go home tonight, my next job is to make connections between these tier 3 words that I don't know and the things that I do know. Like, that's my job when I get home. And then my next step is, you know, Ollie Cav's work on organizing ideas. I'm then going to create a advanced organizer or a mind map or a timeline, whatever it might be, that allows me to visualize and to make the easiest connection in my schema for this new knowledge to link to the old knowledge. And then you want the kid to go, but I appreciate just making a mind map is not going to solve my problem. So I'm then going to make retrieval questions and I'm
Mm.
going to practice them for the next 7 days. So when I walk into my next lecture, I'm in a better place. Now, I would ask any teacher in a school, any leader in a school, saying, if you've not prepared kids to walk into a lecture and think like that, then we're setting them up to fail. Like, surely our jobs is not just to get them the grades to go to university, but to get them to go to university and flourish. And so a kid is only going to make those decisions at university if we teach them independence, step by step, understanding how to make good decisions, and then let them start to make them. And when they do make bad ones, like we do with teachers, like we do with coaching, put a limelight on it and shine it a spotlight and say, right, you made a bad decision. Let's unpick it. Why did you make it? Talk me through it. And that's that final step. Talk about adaptive expertise. It's actually putting a spotlight on those decisions. So what I'm talking about in the book is that it's a growth all the way through school. So when you get to 16, 17, when you've got more time to have those one-on-one kind of tutor sessions with kids, you are really doing those kind of icing on the cake moments where you're unpicking those kind of fine-tuned decisions ready for kind of university. And, if anyone opens the book and reads the first page and thinks, my kids won't do that, then it's worthiness in them reading the rest of it, because there are strategies in there, I think, that will prepare them for kind of, that step. And I'm guilty of it too. I would, in our school, it was a very successful school, great results. Kids went to Oxford and Cambridge. Did we allow them to go there and have that level of knowledge of how what learning happens? No, we didn't. And I'd love for other schools to tell me that they did, but I've not found that many out there that go to that level, really.
And that's like my next provocation to you was going to be around, okay, so you're talking a lot about independence here and about how it's so important for students to get to the point where they can take the stuff on independently. But how do we bridge that gap between these revision skills, these learning habits being explicitly taught and getting them to the point where they can be taken on independently? And like what you've just said there has totally addressed it. But I think
Yeah.
what's interesting about what you've said is that you're not just addressing this in terms, you just explained really clearly, essentially, how you start off by teaching these things explicitly to the students. And then eventually you're just gradually handing over the reins of responsibility to them. Again, it chimes really nicely with the adaptive expertise framework
Yeah.
in our book around, you've got to get them to the point where they're able to make good decisions, but then have the mindset to want to continue to make good decisions outside of your lessons.
Mm.
So they're not reliant on you being there prompting them. But what really stands out to me in what you've just said there is that you're not doing that just with an eye on getting them the results that you want right now at GCSE. You're doing that with this driven by this kind of moral imperative to send them off to university or send them off to do A levels if you're looking at GCSE, better equipped to be independent learners, to be the independent learners that they're going to have to be when they get to that level of study. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's setting them up for success, isn't it? Like, Malcolm Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours to be an expert, at an individual thing. And as calculated, the kids are in school in the UK for about 14,000 hours in the time. So they've got enough time to become expert learners. And
Yeah.
even when they're not being explicitly taught it, everything they're doing is learning, right? So they're applying that skill set, that knowledge every single day to what they're doing. And so over that 14,000 hours, could we set that lofty goal to become an expert learner? I think we can. But it has to start off, right from the beginning, kind of, in steps. And sunk cost fallacy was one. Another one that will link this, learning habits, habits afterwards. But one of the things that kind of I learned a lot along the way, and I think the last part of the book about habits was the bit that, as I said, that like I didn't know I was going to go in that direction. It was only when I realized how hard it was for kids to make decisions that I realized that in order for us to actually solve this, we can't, even when we've given them the tools and they have knowledge that they're going to kind of, make good decisions all of a sudden is really hard. And one of the research I look at is Thorndike, which is kind of there's a quote, if I can find it, because what it exactly says, right? It says, it's the law of effect. And it basically says that we repeat behaviors that are satisfying and we remove behaviors that are unpleasant,
Mhm.
and we quit them. And like, as soon as I read that, I thought to myself, retrieval practice is unpleasant.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And what I thought was really interesting, because Bjork calls them desirable difficulties, right?
Yeah.
Interleaving retrieval and space practice are desirable difficulties. It's a terrible name because they're not desirable. Like I get the fact that from a teaching point of view, there are desirable things for us to want kids to do, but for the child, they're anything but. And so when you've got a child and they go home and they've had a tough day in school and then maybe they've underachieved in a test, to go home and say, you know what, get out some flashcards and get answers wrong,
Yeah.
right? You're going to feel worse about yourself. And so, go looking back at that quote, like, we remove stuff from our life that is unpleasant. And retrieval practice by nature is unpleasant. You're holding up in
By
front of you
design.
by design. Exactly. That is that is the exact reason we do it, right?
Mm.
So you put a flashcard in front of a child, and this is the other argument, the other problem, like, kids sometimes, even some of our good kids would make flashcards, but they'd make them from the knowledge that they already had. Right? So they're going to get 100% in it. So a kid will go home and they'd go, I'm going to make some flashcards tonight. There are 3 electrons in lithium. Well, they already know there's 3 electrons in lithium. Why are they making a flashcard when knowledge is already in their long-term memory? So even when kids were making flashcards,
Yeah.
they were not making flashcards of the stuff they're going to hold up in front of them in the mirror and say, I don't understand. They were getting 10 out of 10 and creating this illusion that they're really successful learners. When actually, if you set it up right, kids are going to go home at the end of the day when they're tired and look at a flashcard and get it wrong and then go, actually, I'm worse than I thought I was. It's not going to help. And so you're going to remove things from your life that make in the moment are unpleasant. And so all of those strategies that we want them to do are unpleasant. So you look at the defining factor of what forms habits from the law of effect. Anything that we want a kid to do that is unpleasant is not naturally going to become a habit over time. So just by us, again, going back to that assembly, go and do flashcards, it will not become a habit because it could be a habit if the flashcards are rubbish, if they're too easy, but then it defeats the point. But if it's done in the true sense that they're retrieving stuff that they've slightly lost and it's going to be challenging, then it won't be a habit that ever forms because it's an unpleasant habit and therefore it will go. And so when I looked at that definition, I sat there and thought, oh, wow, this is bigger. This is a bigger problem than I thought. Like, we are literally asking kids to do something that no kid is going to
Want to do.
and exactly. I'm going to want to do and going to have that feel good factor about doing. So that, and then I remember someone else at research, I couldn't remember who it was, talking about, interleaving. We know from interleaving that short-term performance is worse. So when you interleave questions, examination results in the short term fall. So any kid that interleaves, again, is going to feel, you put interleaved questions in front of a child, they're going to feel like they're not very good at learning. They're not going to feel successful. Again, what happens when you don't feel successful? You put it to one side and you don't do it. Right? So you're looking at how do we get kids to form good habits? Like, it's going to be really, really hard because the habits we want them to form are not natural things that humans are going to do. And so the last part of the book became a lot bigger than I thought. And I had to do a lot more research into behavioral psychology. How do we get kids to make decisions, even when they know they're right, because they're not going to want to make them because they make them feel rubbish about themselves.
So give us some hope then, Richard, because there must be some hope.
Because
I've been to the gym today and it was unpleasant. I can absolutely tell you that last kilometre was horrible, but I still did it. So what is it that's making me do that? And then how do you get kids to want to put themselves in those uncomfortable situations and know it's for my greater good?
Yeah. So I've got, it's probably 2 stories that come to mind. So I talk about the habit cycle, which James Clear talks about Atomic Habits, about the 4 stages of the habit cycle. But I'm going to focus on the initial one first, because I think it's a really good story. And it's about the cue. The first stage of forming a habit is identifying that you have one in the first place, right? My wife bites her nails. She has no idea that she bites her nails. She sits on the sofa and I'll say to her, stop biting your nails. She went, oh, don't, I didn't realize I was, So she doesn't even recognize the cue. The cue is anxiety, right? She's anxious. She doesn't, and it's a feeling that causes her to make a decision, right? So the cue is a really, really important part when getting kids to change decision making. And so one great story that I talk about in the book comes from The Power Habits by Charles Duhigg. I'm not sure I said his name right. Dewey, right? But basically, in the 1900s, only 7% of Americans brush their teeth.
Okay.
Right? 7% of Americans brush their teeth in the 1900s. 7%, right?
Okay.
And they created an advert, and I'll talk about what the advert is in a second. And in the space of 5 years, that went from 7 to 65% of Americans, right?
Okay.
So if there's one advert which plays on the fact that cues are important, can change an entire country, right? Pretty much in the space of 5 years. then we can apply the same kind of principles of our behavioral psychology to do the same with kids, right? Because thinking about brushing your teeth is, again, there's nothing desirable about it,
Yeah.
right? No one gets up in the morning and goes, "Yay, come on, let's go to the bathroom," right? But you do it every day, right? It becomes a habit. So how can we have stuff, if we compare brushing your teeth to retrieval practice, right? They managed to make advertisers who are very clever people that can play on behavioral psychology, got the entire country to change their decisions based on using behavioral psychology. And what they did was they got people to identify a cue. Now, the problem is that people didn't really know they had bad breath in the
Mhm.
1900s, right? It is what it is. Like they didn't notice it. So the advert that ran in the papers was to get people. They told people to take their tongue and place it on their top teeth.
Mhm.
Now, I've got this now because I've been talking a lot, and so you get it after a while. But if you didn't brush your teeth for 3 or 4 days, or maybe even after like 24 hours, or if you get on a plane or something like that, you notice that you get this uh, thin, kind thin film on
Yeah.
your top teeth that
Okay.
basically is like horrible rubbish that's built up over time, right? And so what they said on this video was, if you take your tongue and put it on your top teeth, and you can feel this film on your teeth,
Yeah.
then your teeth must smell, right?
Okay. Okay.
And so what everyone in America then did is they took their tongue, put it on their teeth, and went, "Ooh, my teeth must smell. I must go and brush them."
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was as simple as that, right? And so then you had this whole society change where every time someone would move their tongue onto their teeth, that was the cue to acknowledge. That was the cue to tell all these people that you had bad breath. But they didn't know it until they did that. So they created this scenario where everyone knew that by doing that, that they had bad breath. And so there's just an example of real life where understanding the habit cycle and appreciating that identifying cues is a starting point to get people to change decisions is one way of doing it. I give lots of practical examples in the book of how to do that, and I also want schools to have the free reign to take that as an idea and go, how can we do that? But one useful strategy I talk about, which is linked to this idea, is the idea of point and call.
Mhm. Okay.
So they've done this in the Japanese railway, that effectively they've reduced accidents by, I think it's about 70-80%, but don't quote me on it, but it's pretty high, by pointing and calling. And what they do on the railways in Japan is that they point at every decision as they're doing it. So they'll point and go green light, green light. They'll
Mhm.
point and go doors closed, doors closed. And they'll do this through every single step. And that's because without the cue, they sometimes miss steps, right? So the pointing is the physical cue that gets them to slow down their thinking and actually check every step along the way. The pointing makes them make better decisions effectively, in that moment. And it's reduced kind of problem issues on the railway in terms of safety. Now, I say apply the same principles to kids, right? Now, we look at the extreme example. A kid walks into a classroom and they walk around for a while, don't take their bag off. They have a chat with about 4 friends. They might look up at the board for a moment. They look back down. They don't. They then try to get a pen out. They haven't got a pen on them. They've lost it. And eventually they sit down. They don't get their book out. They carry on chatting. And you go through this whole thing of a kid making lots of poor decisions in kind of a 5-minute period. Now, with a lot of these kids, we put them on report cards and we say, go on report, get yourself a 2, or either give them a smart target, and
Mm.
kind of a lot of the time it doesn't change and things don't happen.
Mm.
And so one of the things I would suggest is take the same principles of this point and call, because what's happening with this child is that they've now formed these habits over time that have become ingrained. And we can talk about where they come from in a second, but they've got these poor habits, right? They walk in a room and they chat to people for 5 minutes. Now, in terms of why that happens, not for every kid, because some kids just want to have a chat. But if we go back to that kind of expression, that law of effect, right? Kids will stop doing stuff if it feels unpleasant. Now, we have a problem in schools where sometimes when kids fall behind, walking into a classroom where you feel dumb is a very unpleasant feeling.
Mm.
Right? Walking into a classroom where you know you're going to underachieve and you know that you have gaps in your knowledge doesn't feel good. So if you've got two options, one is to sit down, look at that board, and not be able to do any of it, which feels very unpleasant.
Mm.
Or option two, walk around the room, chat with your friends for 5 minutes without even realizing it. They're making a decision that is a really poor one. And if you and sometimes when you say to a kid, "What are you doing?" and they go, "I don't know," they may actually mean it. because the habit is automatic. It's the same as us touching a hot pan and our hand shooting off the pan straight away. It's a natural response of kind of to protect us, right? So these kids, some of these kids, and we're talking about the extreme. We're not talking about like good revision strategies. We're talking about basic kid in a classroom going in and making poor decision after poor decision. They don't even know why they're making them anymore. You know,
Mm.
if you ask that kid, why are you walking around the room? They're not going to say, I feel anxious because I don't understand the work on the board. That's long gone for some of those kids. It's just something that's built up over time. And the other thing we know about habits is that we're fine tuned to believe that the now is much more important than the future. So like, so this is why sometimes like immediate detentions are much better than giving them on a Friday at the end of the week. Because I tell a story in the book where I did a cycle ride from London to Paris a couple of months ago for charity. And a year ago, someone said, "Do you want to cycle to Paris?" And I said, "Yeah, not a problem. You know, I'll do it." Right.
Yeah.
But if someone said to me next week, "Do you want to cycle to Paris on Friday?" Of course I'd say no,
Yeah.
right? And that's because the immediate thing always feels bigger or worse than it does kind of, later on, right? So when a kid walks in a room, the immediate anxiety of feeling like I can't do this outweighs some detention they may or may not get 5 days later, right? And so although there's a deterrent, and I'm not saying get rid of them because they have to happen,
Mm.
that kid is not equating those two things as equal. The habit that's formed over time is in the classroom. So going back to that original point about point and call, one thing you can get kids to do is a habit tracker where they write down all the decisions that they make. They go through them. I walk in a classroom, or if it's with a teaching assistant, you get a teaching assistant to write the habits that they see the kid do, and then literally show them and say, "These are all the decisions that you make in the first 10 minutes of a lesson. Let's decide which of these are good and which of these are bad."
Mm.
So they might, they can identify them. They can say that's a bad decision. I talk to kids. They might say I got my book out. That's a good decision. So they'll be able to identify getting their book out was a good decision in that lesson. So then you adopt the point and call system. Then you say, right, these are 5 good decisions that you need to make. So you're going to walk in the room and you're
Okay.
going to point at those decisions because you don't make them automatically. You don't go to those decisions. They just happen in the flow of all these bad decisions, right? So just the same on the Japanese railway. To improve the chances of making a decision, they have to point at it to recognize the cue. So rather than setting kids up to fail with a report card that says be better, you know, actually sit there and go, well, you've got 5 points to make in your classroom. You need to walk in the room and point at your bag. That's your first good decision you make. You point at your bag because you know inside that bag is your book and your pen. The next thing you do is you put your book on the table and you point at it. And then that kid's done 2 right things in that lesson. The next thing you do is you point at the board because you know that's where the work is going to be. And so if you get a kid who just walks in the room and makes 3 really quick, good decisions, you've started off a whole different process. And
Mm.
and linked to that, the other really good story in the book that I like, which we can take kind of note from, is the couch to 5K.
Yeah.
So we know that was really successful. And the reason that was successful is because you start small, right? The first thing you have to do is run to the end of your street. That's it on the couch to 5K. When people get to the end of their street, nobody turns around. They keep running,
Okay.
right? The hardest thing to do with a new habit is to start. That's why they say put your shoes at the door. Put your kit by the door as you in the morning. That's going to help you do everything you can to make that first decision as easy as possible. Because once you've started, you're more likely to make a good one. And what we need to do, and we talk about belief. You mentioned it earlier. Like we need kids to believe they're good learners. They need to believe it. They can't believe they're a good learner if they don't know what learning looks like. And then when they know what it looks like, we need to get them to make good learning decisions. And if a kid can walk out of a lesson and feel successful because they pointed at 5 good decisions they made in the first 5 minutes, then maybe that 5 minutes turns into 10 good minutes, and so on and so on. And it might
You're
start
talking about
change the
momentum.
process.
It's
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
It's the building of momentum, and like you say, it's that like once you can get them to do that first thing, it then just does kind of snowball from there. But
Yeah.
what's so interesting as well is, and from a primary perspective, it's interesting hearing you talk about this because a lot of the time, if we've got a student I can think about in my school right now, who we've had some real success with in terms of
Mm.
like getting him back into class and working and focused and actually getting stuff done. doing something like quite similar, not exactly the same. And actually,
Mm.
like hearing you talk about like the physical cue of pointing to the good decisions, I think that's probably a step up from what we've done so far. But there's a little tick list of those really minor things, right? I'm in my seat in
Yeah,
time for the
yeah,
do now activity. Bam. I've completed the do now activity. Bam. So it's really breaking down so that by the time you're 5 minutes into the lesson, by the time ultimately the teacher says, okay, and the learning objective for today is, that kid has already succeeded 5 times.
exactly, yeah,
You've got
exactly,
the
yeah,
momentum. Um,
yeah,
but the idea of actually, again, I think what you're talking about there, though, and it ties with what you were talking about earlier around taking something from being explicit into it just becoming a habit that they continue independently
yeah.
by getting them to explicitly point out the good decisions that they've made. Then again, it just pushes them towards that point of independence, perhaps that little bit more effectively. And certainly, I imagine for older students as well, that's even more effective because they're able to properly reflect on that and articulate the decisions that they've
Yeah,
made. Right?
and if we go back to the revision, for older kids, it might just literally be. So one of the things we know with older kids we have a problem with is that when they get home from school, is they often revise the subject they're really good at, not the ones they're
Okay.
bad at, because they want to feel good about themselves, right? They love geography, they want to take it at A level, so they go home and they revise it every night, and they put off the other subject. And so even then, if that kid goes through their habits, if a kid writes a habit scorecard of the decisions that they make that evening and go through it with a form tutor or someone and unpick that conversation. Why did you pick geography? Why did you go with that one first? Okay, and
Yeah.
tonight you're actually going to go home, you're going to point at that maths book and you're going to go, I'm doing maths first. And by consciously pointing at it, and again, it's a small thing, and this is just one example, and there are lots more, but I tried to take example, from that kind of brushing your teeth scenario. Like, if kids don't even know they're walking through the door and they're picking up geography subconsciously. No,
Mm-hmm.
they're not stopping to go,
Mm.
why am I doing this tonight? This, and again, the same way you do with teachers, with coaching, like you have to break down the decisions the teachers make to make them aware and put a spotlight on why they did what they did. I'm saying the same rationale with kids. When they make decisions, often their gut feeling and they're emotional and they're biased. And so the point and call is one example where you have to slow down your thinking. You have to pause and make a conscious decision, about what you're doing in that moment. And so, people have done this to stop. People use these strategies to stop smoking, to stop alcohol, and all of these things. So I'm saying if we could stop alcoholics by
Yeah.
using point and call, then surely we can use these principles to help kids. Because kids want to make better decisions, but but
Mm-mm.
but but the changing that habit of a lifetime is really difficult. So even when they know, I should be doing X and not Y, if they're going into it habitually and they don't even know they're doing it in the moment, that's where the cue comes in, and that's where that has to be kind of recognized.
It's interesting. I think like if I was to try and summarize it and tell me if this is accurate or not, but I think I would say that what you're saying is that you want to try and take something that's tacit, so like these
Yeah,
tacit decision making habits that they've got. You want to try and expose it as explicit. You want to generate this moment of insight where they realize that this decision that they're making is flawed and actually it's not the one they want to
yeah,
make. And then you keep it explicit while you kind of work on that decision and scaffold it together, and you create all of these things like the point and call. So all of those scaffolds go in. All of the while, these decision making changes that you're making are really explicit, and then
mm,
eventually you rely, once that momentum has built, you rely on it then becoming tacit again.
yeah. And the end goal really then is when they understand how to form a new habit, that they start making new habits themselves, right? So
Right.
then they go to the point. Your end goal when they say 16 seconds, they go, right. Actually, okay, I've now changed this. Point and call worked here.
Mm-hmm.
Another example is implementation intentions, where you kind of stack a decision with another decision that you kind of reward based one. So, like, really interesting one. And the kid said this to me, and I thought was brilliant. Like, sometimes kids make mind maps and pretty notes for comfort,
Mm.
and it's actually a reward. It feels good about themselves, right? So what you can do sometimes, and this was a kid who I ran a session with, and they said, "Sir, I really like making notes. It makes me feel good. So can I embed that in my implementation intention?" And what that is you take something you don't want to do and you add to the end of it something you do want to do. And what happens then, it tricks your brain into a dopamine hit, because dopamine comes with the idea of reward way before the reward actually happens.
Okay, yeah.
So if a kid goes, and this was a kid saying to me, a 17-year-old kid at a session I did out in Dubai, said, "Sir, so taking what you said, if I do the notes afterwards that make me feel good about myself, will I get the dopamine hit whilst I'm doing the retrieval, knowing that I'm making the notes? I've not lost that nervousness of the notes because I'm still doing them. I know that I'm not doing the notes anymore to help me learn, but I am
Mm-hmm.
doing the notes to make me feel good and comfortable." I went, "That's perfect. You've understood the principles that we've applied today, and you've looked at yourself as an individual, and you've gone, if I do retrieval followed by my comfort of note taking,
Mm.
then I'm going to be more likely to stick to the retrieval." And that's the end goal, right? When you've taught the kids how to do habits, and this goes again beyond learning, because people have lots of bad habits. So if a kid then takes this and they go, "I'm going to stop smoking by using the same principles, of vaping now, isn't it?
Mm.
I'm going to stop vaping as a consequence of having the skill set, what habits are." Because Atomic Habits is sold over 1 million copies. So adults all over the world are looking at ways to make better decisions and to stop ourselves making poor ones. So, like, why are we not teaching this idea of habits to kids and then allowing them to have the agency to then go, "I'm going to now change my life for the better,
Mm.
not just my schooling, but I'm now going to stop doing X. I'm going to stop hanging out with this person, or I'm going to stop doing these other things that make me feel really bad."
Mm.
And so it opens up the door. Actually, like when I read Atomic Habits years ago, I became better at making good decisions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So why can't we do this, much earlier? All this stuff is out there, and so it's just about how do we package it in a way that kids can apply to learning, but eventually apply to their, their real lives, and that would be the real goal, is to have one kid one day stop me in the street and go, "Now not only did I become a better learner, but actually I stopped doing this, or I started going running, or I started getting healthier, I stopped eating junk food," because the principles of habits go way beyond kind of school, but we can use them for school, but we can apply them to make everyone make better decisions and have healthier lifestyles, really.
That is a noble, lofty, and ambitious aim, but like I'm right
It
behind
is.
you. I think what
You
we should
gotta,
do,
yeah,
what would be really cool is at some point at some conference somewhere, maybe we should like take this idea, because you keep saying this is similar to some of the work we're doing around coaching as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
We should do a session where we look at like these same principles and we go, well, this is what it looks like in coaching. This is what it might
yeah,
look like in teaching students to be independent learners. That would be a really cool sort of spin on this on these ideas to do together.
yeah. It's interesting because I've used a Dreyfus model about developing from novice to expertise,
Hmm.
and like you were talking about your 4 stages earlier,
Yep.
I've created a very similar model for kids. What does a novice learner look like? What does an expert learner look like? What does a proficient learner look like? How are those stages different?
Fab.
And what was really interesting is when I shared this with the school last week, I did a session with their teaching and learning team. They looked at them and they could actually pick out their kids in their school and go, "Well, the kid's there, a kid's there, a kid's there," and they realized that none of their kids, even they looked at their best ones, their brightest, their top A stars, they were like, "None of our kids are there." So
Yeah.
they could, when you put it in front of them and realize it's a journey, you can actually take kids and go, "Well, actually," even with different decisions, you can be in different layers of learning. But yeah, that'd be really interesting, I think, actually, because I think that was what was great about the direction this went in, is that it started off from a whole different area, and it started off with Sarah in there, but you and her ran a session I came to online where you talked about adaptive expertise, and those eureka moments of going, this applies across society, doesn't it? It's not just about
That's it.
teachers. Yeah. So yeah, that'd be really cool.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, we got to wrap up relatively soon,
Yeah,
but let's. I was desperate to ask you about the second book,
yeah,
which I've had a little bit of insight on, because you've told me lots about it, which is I just think it's a fascinatingly innovative take on the retention crisis that we've currently got. Do you want to just tell everybody exactly what it is and when can we get
yeah.
hold of it?
Yeah, so that'll be a long time. It will be a long time, yeah. But I'll give you my deadline is February to finish, and then it'll be
Yeah,
hopefully be September, ready for the new academic year. So the new ECTs as well coming out. Hopefully, if it all goes right. But basically, I became a supply teacher, back in April, and I remember my agent saying to me, "Good luck," and I responded saying, "Don't worry about it. It's only supply." Which I put it in the preface of the book, because I walked into my first supply lesson with like 10 years of senior leadership and 21 years of teaching, and like I fell on my sword. I was terrible.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was the hardest thing I have ever done. I had a massive blind spot of just how hard it was to be a supply teacher. The kids' treatment of you, of what you know, and I wasn't just the first school I walked in. You know, I've interviewed over 100 supply teachers. Like, it is really hard to walk into a school blind without relationships when those kids think that the lesson is not useful, and try and do something with it. And so it started off with really me realizing that I'm in the deep end here and I don't have the skill set I needed, to really think carefully about how do we help a group of, a very, very large group. There are, on any one day, the census suggests there are 18,000 supply teachers in UK schools. So that, and I think I've calculated on a daily basis, 400,000 kids in the UK are taught by supply teachers, on
Wow.
a daily basis. And so, like, how do we, first of all, like, upskill these people? How do we provide them with the skill set? Because in teacher training, nobody prepares you to be a supply teacher.
It's a big
Like,
part of the workforce as well.
oh, it's
By all
massive. It's
accounts in
massive.
that case.
Like, and so cognitive science, like applying cognitive science to supply teaching is something that I've, since the learning habits has gone into production and looking away, I've spent the last kind of 6 months since I'm doing it thinking, how do I get really good on the fly at making learning happen? How does that happen? And one of the things that, like, has saddened me the most about interviewing so many supply teachers is that a lot of them, they're very vulnerable in a sense that, like, they don't feel like schools treat them with the same respect that they treat each other. And I don't, and I have felt this. I've walked into staff rooms and people won't even look at you. And actually, it's partly because people are too busy with their own, their own lives. But as a supply teacher walking in who already feels like you're less, it's really tough. And so what I want to be able to do is provide people with the skill set to hopefully go in a room and feel like you can make a difference in 60 minutes. Feel like no matter what gets put in front of you, if it's, a shoddy lesson plan where they've just said, make a poster for an hour. There's nothing more demoralizing than a supply teacher walking in and being left a poster, because you feel like the teacher doesn't think like you can do a good job. You walk in and they don't even realize that they're doing that. And sometimes it's because they were sick and they couldn't make anything. And I get it. Setting work is hard. I've been on the other side of it. Like, it's not about the supply teacher. It's not. You're not setting them bad work because you think they can't do anything better. But that just happens sometimes. When you're the supply teacher and you get left a poster, your heart sinks. It does. Like, you walk in a room, you're not there to do poster work. You're there to try and help kids. And so how can we in the moment add value to poor, shoddy supply work is something I've thought really carefully about. And actually, I've grabbed help from as many people as I can who are experts at different things. So people that have written books on oracy, or people that have written books on scaffolding, and said, right, you're an expert on scaffolding. You've written a whole book on this for teachers. Give me 500 words on scaffolding for supply. Like, how do they take all of your knowledge? Because I'm not the expert at scaffolding. You are. Take your expertise in this area. How could you help a supply teacher on the fly with this? And I'm trying to bring in as much expertise as possible, because this group of people who, as you said, have a massive role to play, deserve conferences. They deserve to have a book written, especially for them, in how to be really good at your job. And my hope is then that when they have the professional knowledge that they need, or get the support that they need, they can go into school, make a difference, and go home and feel good about themselves. And a small part of this is that there's a caveat, a small hope that actually, if some people that left teaching because it was too hard, because they couldn't cope and found it difficult, might decide to go back after doing some supply and getting this book and realizing, actually, I now understand some of these principles I didn't understand before. Now I've got a bit more knowledge. Maybe if I go back next time, it won't be as hard. And getting some supply teachers back into the workforce. So, a survey was done by the DfE last year. 69% of supply teachers said they'd consider coming back full time. They would, yeah. They would, for the right school, in the right circumstance. So there are people that do supply that might come back full time, and this book can hopefully be a tool that can close that gap and to give it a real push, is to give them the belief they maybe need in themselves. And the other thing on this is, I've been guilty of this. I've looked at application forms where people have got down 15 schools, and I thought to myself really badly that and wrong that, like, they must not be a good teacher because surely someone would have taken them.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
when you see 15 schools, you think maybe they're not a good teacher. And actually, if you can get to an application form and a cover letter, and you can write about cognitive science and how you've used cognitive science as a supply teacher, and you can get to interview and talk about what you've done in the classroom, I think you could really impress, a head teacher to go, this is someone who's worth giving a job to. And that's another goal, getting them to win a job application over somebody else when it looks on their CV that they're not as good just because they've had supply. And there's
mm,
this
mm,
wrong premise that supply teachers are bad teachers, and it isn't the case. And you've been a supply, you've done
yeah,
supply, I've done supply.
mm,
Lots of people that have written books and are adding value to this book uh, have also done supply. So we've been there, done it, and come out of it, better as a consequence of doing it. And so if I can help other people be brave enough or give them the skill set, or just the confidence to make that leap, it's going to help the whole kind of retention crisis, isn't it? So again, you talked about noble causes earlier.
mm.
Um, I went into teaching to make the biggest difference possible, and I used to think that was being a head teacher. I used to think the head teacher was what would be the biggest impact I could make. And now when I look at like my role, that's why I'm writing books. That's why I'm doing kind of part-time consultancy, because I now believe that I've got something to share, whether it's with learning habits with kids or whether it's with supply teachers. Can I add value to a part of the sector where there's gaps? The answer is yes. And so that's kind of what I'm doing now. That's that ability. That's what I want to do. I want to help, as many kids as possible. And if that's improving supply lessons, then, hopefully that will help. And if, one person reads the book and teaches better supply lessons or goes back into full-time teaching, and it's done its job, hasn't it? So that's kind of where I'm at now.
And that's, that's why we set up this podcast series of From the Thought Space, because like we genuinely do believe that it's not only those that are working in schools day in day out that are able to make a difference. And sometimes you hear that rhetoric, and it's just not one that we subscribe to. We're like
Mm,
absolutely in awe of people that are in schools doing the work day in day out. And I'm current serving deputy head, so I know what that's like. But at the same time, we do also believe that there's a fundamental space that can be filled by people like yourself who are spending at least some of their week doing that
mm,
consultancy stuff. And we shouldn't assume that anybody that's doing that kind of work is doing so because they want to make a ton of money out of it. Like your purpose is clearly very much morally driven, and it is
mm.
about making as big a difference as you possibly can. If if we've got 65% of those 18,000 supply teachers, let's say there's 18,000, right? We know there's
Yeah,
more, but
yeah,
on any given day, if there's 18,000, if we get 65% back into the classroom, that's an additional 10,500 teachers. That would
yeah,
solve the retention crisis more or
yeah,
less with
yeah,
that, right? So
yeah,
I absolutely hats off to you. I think that what you're doing is fantastic. I think it's in every single way possible. It's with the best interests of the sector at heart, and you clearly want to make a massive difference in not just in the classroom that you're teaching in, but you're trying to make that difference with the wider sector, and
mm.
that's something to be absolutely applauded and celebrated.
I
When
appreciate that.
when can we get our hands on Learning Habits? When is that out?
February 25th,
February the
I think.
25th.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all. I just did the final copy editing stuff on the weekend, so it's all done now. So yeah, it's just yeah. The publishers know better than me with dates. They say that before Christmas is a really bad idea time to release books, so they're saying February. So
There
yeah,
you
I'm
go.
going with that. But yeah. So that's the plan. But you can pre-order now. It's on Amazon, so you can pre-order it, and yeah, you can. Won't be hard to find because it's a number one hot release in about 7 categories. So yeah. So I don't
Oh,
know if
there
it'll stay
you
there for
go.
long.
That was a you did that so subtly as well. It won't be hard to. That's incredible, and that as well should be massively celebrated. A hot new release in 6 or 7 different categories on Amazon is a massive achievement. We'll make sure that in the notes for this episode we put the link to the to Amazon
Oh, brilliant.
where you can pre-order the book as well. And having had a bit of a sneak peek at the book, I can absolutely vouch for the fact that it is gold. And I think, to be honest, just the conversation that we've had tonight, I think that there's a lot of people who will be feeling utterly convinced that that is a book they need to buy, um, and I'm not surprised because, yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation, Richard. So thank you so
Oh, I
much
appreciate it.
for your time, and we'll have to get you back on nearer the time of the launch of book number 2 for supply
Oh,
teachers.
yeah. Brilliant. Definitely. All right.
Brilliant. Thanks
you
very
very much,
much
Adam.
indeed, Richard, and thanks to everybody out there in podcast land listening along to this episode of the EduPulse podcast as part of our From the Thought Space series. And we will hopefully see you again next time for another episode.